My mother-in-law stood up at my baby shower in front of 50 guests and told me to stop eating for 2, but she had no idea what my mother was about to do next. I was 34 weeks pregnant, standing in my own backyard, holding a glass of sparkling cider I could no longer feel in my hand. 50 guests watched my mother-in-law raise her champagne flute like she was christening a ship. Her name was Vivian Cole, and she had spent 3 years measuring my body like a listing she couldn't sell. "Let's hope Emma remembers she can finally stop eating for 2, she said, smiling for the cameras. Nobody laughed. A little boy by the fence lowered his bubble wand. Someone's fork clattered onto a plate and stayed there. My napkin tore clean through in my fist. She wasn't finished. Maybe she can get back in the gym before Ethan is embarrassed to be seen with her. My husband's chair went over backward into the grass. Ethan was already on his feet, his face gone the color of the tablecloth. My sister-in-law Claire had her hand pressed flat over her mouth. 50 people who had come to celebrate a baby now sat frozen around a dessert table, watching a woman none of them expected to see unravel like this in public. The string lights above us were just starting to compete with the fading daylight. Someone's phone camera, up until 30 seconds earlier, pointed at the diaper cake, hung frozen at their side. I remember the specific, absurd detail of a bee circling the abandoned cider pitcher, the only thing in that backyard still moving with any purpose. My mother-in-law stood there in a cream-colored dress she'd bought for the occasion, flute still raised half an inch, waiting, I think, for the laugh that had always come before. It didn't come. 50 guests, most of whom had known her for years, sat in a silence so complete I could hear the sprinkler 2 yards over ticking through its cycle. My mother didn't yell. She didn't argue. My mother, Linda Whitfield, 5'2", 61 years old, set down a pitcher of lemonade with the calm of someone closing a cabinet door. "I'll handle this," she said. "I want you to understand that sentence the way I understood it in that moment, not as comfort, as a warning fired quietly enough that only Vivian and I heard the caliber. Because my mother does not raise her voice. My mother plans, and she had been planning for 3 weeks. To understand why her calm was more dangerous than any scream, you have to go back 3 years, to a fertility clinic waiting room in Solon, Ohio, and to a woman who once called my wedding dress fine for a plain kind of pretty. I was 28 when I married Ethan Cole. He was 30, an easygoing structural engineer with a habit of humming while he drove, and absolutely no idea back then how much work his mother would eventually require from both of us. I taught 4th grade at Briar Hill Elementary. We'd been together 5 years by the time we got married, long enough that I thought I understood the whole family. I understood almost none of it. Vivian had been a real estate agent for 26 years before she retired, and she brought the job home with her the way some people bring home a cold. She walked into a room and appraised it. Furniture, haircuts, bodies, everything got a number in her head, and she wasn't shy about saying it out loud. At our engagement dinner, at a steakhouse in Beechwood that Vivian picked and Vivian did not offer to pay for, she held my hand across the table, looked at my hair, and said, "You know, a good balayage would really open up your face." 20 minutes later, she looked at the sample swatch I'd brought for my dress and said it was fine for a plain kind of pretty. Ethan laughed it off in the car. "That's just how she talks," he said. "She said the same thing about my ex-girlfriend's apartment. I filed it away." That's what you do in the beginning. You file things away because the alternative is starting a war before the wedding even happens. She only ever did it to women. Ethan could gain 15 pounds over a winter, and Vivian would call him prosperous and pat his stomach with something like pride. His father, Gordon, a quiet man who ran a hardware store in Chagrin Falls for 30 years, had gained probably 40 pounds since I'd known him, and Vivian had never once mentioned it. She reserved her measuring tape for daughters-in-law. Vivian had spent 26 years selling houses in the eastern suburbs of Cleveland, and she'd been good at it. Good enough that she'd made President's Club at her brokerage 6 years running. Good enough that she still kept a plaque from 2011 in the front hallway where visitors couldn't miss it. She talked about people the way she talked about listings. A niece's new boyfriend had good bones but needs work. A neighbor's remodeled kitchen was trying too hard. I used to find it almost funny, in the beginning, the way you find a family member's quirks funny before you understand they aren't quirks at all, just patterns nobody has bothered to name yet. At my own bridal shower, 2 months before the wedding, Vivian had stood beside the gift table and told my Aunt Denise, within my hearing, that I carried my weight well for someone with my frame. A sentence I turned over in my head for a week, trying to figure out if it had been a compliment. It hadn't been. I understand that now. At the time, I told myself I was being oversensitive, that Vivian simply talked like an appraiser because she'd spent a career being one, and that translating her into a normal register was my job, not hers. Ethan defended her for longer than either of us likes to admit now. Not because he agreed with her. He'd rolled his eyes at the balayage comment, same as I had, but because he'd grown up inside the weather system of Vivian's moods and had built an entire personality around not standing directly in the path of the next front coming through. "She means well," was a sentence he said so often in our first 2 years of marriage that I started keeping a private, half-joking count in my head. By the time of the shower, the count sat somewhere past 40, and he'd stopped saying it entirely, which told me more than any conversation could have. There was a woman before me. Ethan's older brother Mark married a woman named Danielle in 2016, 2 years before Ethan and I got married. Danielle was warm and loud, and she used to bring homemade cannoli to every family dinner, and I liked her immediately, in the uncomplicated way you like someone before you understand the cost of liking them. Danielle and Mark divorced in the spring of 2020 after 4 years of marriage, Nobody in the family explained why. Whenever her name came up, there'd be a pause, a half-beat of silence, and then someone would change the subject. Usually Vivian, usually fast. Once, at a 4th of July barbecue at Vivian and Gordon's house, I asked Claire what happened with Danielle. Claire looked at the grill instead of at me and said, "It just got to be a lot for her. My mom can be a lot." Then she handed me a plate of watermelon and walked away. And I understood that this was a door I wasn't being invited through yet. I didn't push. I should have pushed. There was one detail I did know, because I'd been there for it. In the summer of 2019, a full year before Ethan and I were even engaged, Danielle threw her own baby shower that August, back when she and Mark were still trying, back before the miscarriage that ended things nobody wanted to name. I remember it because I remember Vivian standing up near the end of that party too, glass raised, and saying, almost word for word, that she hoped Danielle would get back to herself soon, for Mark's sake. I remember Danielle's laugh, a little too bright, a little too fast, the laugh of someone deciding in real time not to let a room see her flinch. I remember thinking, at 26 years old, new to this family, and eager to be liked by all of it, that Vivian was just being Vivian, funny in her blunt way, and that Danielle was a good sport for taking it so well. I didn't clock it as a pattern, I clocked it as a personality. 4 years later, standing in my own backyard hearing an almost identical sentence aimed at me, I understood that I'd watched the opening act of my own story once already and mistaken it for someone else's problem. 3 years of infertility got Ethan and me to that backyard shower. 3 years of injections I gave myself at the kitchen counter, timed to a phone alarm. 3 years of negative pregnancy tests, lined up on the bathroom sink like a row of tiny white tombstones. 1 round of IUI in the fall of 2022 that cost us $2,800 out of pocket and failed. A full round of IVF in the spring of 2023 that cost $14,200 after insurance denied the first claim, that ended in a miscarriage at 9 weeks on a Tuesday in June, in a hospital hallway where I gripped the counter so hard I bent my wedding ring. My mother drove 90 minutes from Mansfield that same night and sat on my bathroom floor with me until 2 a.m., not saying much, just being a wall I could lean against without falling over. We started trying in the spring of 2021, casually at first, the way you're supposed to, marking nothing, expecting everything within a few months because that's what happens to everyone else, you know. Nothing happened. By early 2022, I was tracking ovulation with an app and a thermometer I kept in the nightstand, and by that summer we were sitting across from a reproductive endocrinologist named Dr. Amara Osei at a fertility clinic in Beechwood, filling out intake forms that asked questions I'd never had to answer about my own body before. Unexplained infertility, the file eventually said, which is its own particular cruelty. A diagnosis that offers no villain to blame and no clear fix to chase, just a shrug dressed up in medical language. The IUI in the fall of 2022 cost $2,800 we paid out of savings, after insurance covered exactly nothing, and it failed on a Sunday in November. A call from the nurse line while I was standing in the cereal aisle at the grocery store, and I remember setting a box of oatmeal back on the shelf very carefully, like the oatmeal itself might shatter if I wasn't gentle with it. The IVF round in the spring of 2023 was worse, in the specific way that hoping harder always raises the cost of losing. Ethan gave me the trigger shot himself, hands shaking the first time, steady by the third. We had 11 eggs retrieved, 6 that fertilized, 2 that made it to blastocyst, 1 transferred on a Thursday morning in a room that smelled like hand sanitizer, and felt, absurdly, like the most important room I'd ever stood in. It cost $14,200 after the portion insurance eventually agreed to cover, money we pulled partly from savings and partly from a loan against Ethan's 401k that we were still paying back the following year. The pregnancy test came back positive 11 days later. I told my mother before I told Ethan, an accident of timing more than anything, catching her on the phone the second line appeared, both of us crying before either of us said a full sentence. 9 weeks later, at a routine ultrasound, there was no heartbeat where a heartbeat had been the week before. I remember the technician's face going very still and very kind at the same time, the particular expression of someone delivering the worst version of ordinary news. I miscarried 2 days after that, on a Tuesday in June, in a hospital hallway, gripping the counter of the check-in desk hard enough that I bent the setting of my wedding ring, a small dent still visible if you look closely, one I've decided not to have fixed. My mother drove 90 minutes from Mansfield that same night, arriving a little after 10, and sat with me on my bathroom floor until 2 in the morning, not filling the silence with anything, just being a wall I could lean against without either of us falling over. Vivian, when Ethan told her what had happened, sent a fruit basket 2 days later with a card that read, "These things happen for a reason. Maybe your body needs more time to get in shape for this." And I remember reading it twice to make sure I'd understood it correctly, and then setting it on the counter and not touching the fruit for a week. Then, in October of last year, 2 lines on a Tuesday morning. A heartbeat that, 6 weeks later, galloped along at 162 beats per minute on the ultrasound screen. My mother pressed her palm flat against my stomach before there was anything to feel and whispered, "There you are." My father, Robert Whitfield, had been gone 6 years by then, dead of a heart attack in his garage on a Saturday in March. This baby was hers too, in the way that grandchildren become a kind of second chance for grief. Vivian's version of joy looked different. At the announcement dinner, she held our ultrasound photo out at arm's length length, like an appraisal photo for a listing she wasn't sure she wanted to take, and asked when I planned to lose the hormone weight. I was 8 weeks pregnant. I had gained nothing. I hadn't even told my own coworkers yet. She slid the bread basket 6 inches farther from my plate at that dinner, and at every dinner after, with the calm precision of someone repositioning a centerpiece that had drifted out of place. I started eating less before family dinners, so there'd be less on my plate for her to comment on. I caught myself one Wednesday night in April, standing over the kitchen sink at 9 p.m., eating cold rice straight out of the container because I hadn't let myself eat at Sunday dinner, and my body had finally overruled me. Ethan found me there. He didn't say anything dramatic. He just stood in the doorway and said, "That's not a quirk anymore. That's damage." My OB, Dr. Patricia Nunez, said it plainer at my next appointment, when I mentioned I'd been watching things a little more closely since the shower planning started. "Your body is doing exactly what it's supposed to do," she said, looking at me over her glasses. "Her opinion isn't data. You are not required to enter it into the chart." Armed with that, I tried reason one more time. On a Sunday afternoon in Vivian's kitchen, while she frosted a cake she hadn't asked me to help with, I told her as calmly as I could manage that comments about my weight during pregnancy weren't helpful, that my doctor had specifically said the weight I'd gained was healthy for the baby. Vivian smiled at me with something that looked almost like pity. "Doctors say what patients pay to hear," she said, and went back to her piping bag. 16 years of medical training, dismissed over a half-frosted lemon cake. My mother never argued with Vivian, not once, in 4 years. My mother watched and remembered and waited the way she used to wait out a kid in her classroom who was testing limits, letting them run all the way to the edge of the cliff before she said a single word. I didn't understand until much later that she'd been building a file the whole time, the same way I'd been filing away comments since that engagement dinner steakhouse. The difference was that my mother's file had a plan attached to it, and mine, for 3 years, had nothing but a lid on top. By the time we were 32 weeks along, Vivian had escalated past comments into something closer to a campaign, and it happened in stages, each one worse than the last, each one somehow still explainable if you wanted badly enough to explain it away. I wanted badly enough for a long time. That was my mistake, and it's one I'll own for the rest of this story. The first stage came at my 30-week checkup, the week Ethan and I decided to have the shower catered, instead of doing it potluck style, mostly because Vivian had strong opinions about potluck food, and we didn't have the energy left to fight about deviled eggs. Vivian called me directly, not Ethan, which was already unusual, and said she'd like to help plan the menu, just to make sure things are appropriate. I said sure, thinking she meant allergies. She meant portion sizes. She emailed me a spreadsheet, an actual spreadsheet, color-coded, with suggested serving sizes for the mother-to-be, smaller than every other adult portion listed, with a note in the comments column that read, "Keep it light, she'll thank us later." I showed Ethan. He called his mother and asked her to stop. She told him he was being sensitive and that she was just trying to help Emma feel confident in her dress. I let it go. Reasonable people let things go, I told myself. You can't fight every battle. The second stage came 2 weeks later at Sunday dinner, when Vivian brought up my weight gain in front of Gordon, Ethan, Mark, and Mark's new girlfriend, a soft-spoken woman named Priya, who had only met the family twice. 26 pounds already, Vivian said, apropos of nothing, cutting into her pork chop. At 32 weeks, that's a lot, isn't it? The number stopped me cold. I hadn't told her my weight gain. I hadn't told anyone at that table except Ethan, and I certainly hadn't put a specific figure on it in front of his family. I remember looking at Ethan, and Ethan looking just as confused as I was, and both of us deciding, in that silent, married person shorthand, not to make a scene at Priya's second family dinner. Priya, for her part, had gone very still over her plate, the particular stillness of a guest realizing she's stumbled into a family's private weather without an umbrella. Mark tried to redirect, asking Gordon something about the hardware store's new inventory system, and Gordon answered gamely, and the table moved on the way tables do, everyone agreeing silently to let the moment pass rather than examine it. Must have mentioned it and forgotten, I told myself in the car, though I ran back through my last several conversations with Ethan and couldn't find a single one where the number 26 had come up. I filed it away anyway, the way I'd been filing things away since the steakhouse. I want you to remember that number, 26 pounds, because it matters later. The third stage was the gift bag. 3 weeks before the shower, Vivian dropped by unannounced on a Thursday evening, her favorite kind of ambush, the kind that doesn't give you time to arrange your face. Inside a glossy bag with tissue paper folded just so was a silk-wrapped dress, tag still attached, size small, 2 sizes smaller than anything I currently owned. The card in her looping cursive read, "For when you're yourself again." I stood in my own entryway, holding proof that she saw the woman currently carrying her grandchild as a temporary inconvenience, a placeholder body she was already looking past. My hands went cold in a warm house. Ethan wanted to call her that night. I asked him not to. "Let's just get through the shower," I said. "Pick your battles." I didn't know yet that my mother had already stopped picking battles and started building a campaign of her own. The fourth stage came a week later, and it was the first time Vivian brought money into it directly instead of implying it. Since Iris was conceived, Vivian and Gordon had been contributing $50 a month into a $529 college savings account Ethan had set up, a small, steady gesture that had actually meant something to me, one of the only unambiguously kind things Vivian had done since we announced the pregnancy. She called me on a Tuesday evening, and after a few minutes of small talk, mentioned almost in passing that she and Gordon had had been reconsidering their monthly giving, given some tension in the family lately, and that she just wanted things to feel positive again before the baby came. I understood, even though she never said it plainly, that the $50 a month was now conditional on my mood, my gratitude, my willingness to stop pushing back about the spreadsheet and the bread basket and the dress. Ethan was furious when I told him, more furious than he'd been about any single comment up to that point, because comments about my body were aimed at me. But this, he said, was aimed at his daughter before she'd even been born. He called Vivian and told her calmly that we'd rather she kept the $50 than feel entitled to a say in how I lived in my own body. Vivian backed off the threat immediately, framed the whole call as a misunderstanding, and kept contributing to the account without missing a payment. But something in me had already recalibrated. I understood, watching Ethan's jaw tighten on that call, that Vivian didn't only use words as leverage. She used everything she had access to, patiently, one lever at a time, waiting to see which one would move me. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. The fourth stage came 4 days before the shower, and it's the one that, looking back, should have told me everything. I was at my 33-week appointment with Dr. Saul Nunez when her nurse, a woman named Carol who'd worked at Riverside OBGYN for 11 years, pulled me aside in the hallway before I left. "This is a little unusual," Carol said, glancing back toward the front desk, "but I wanted to mention it directly instead of just noting it in your chart. We've had 2 calls this month from someone identifying herself as the grandmother, asking for updates on your weight and your growth measurements. Front desk didn't give out anything, HIPAA obviously, but she was pretty insistent the second time. Wanted to know if you were still on track before some party." Carol said the word party, like she wasn't sure it was her business to say it at all, glancing once more toward the front desk to make sure her supervisor wasn't in earshot. She'd clearly debated whether to mention it at all, and I could see, in the careful way she chose her words, that she'd landed on telling me because something about the calls had bothered her enough to remember them specifically, out of the dozens of calls that hallway fielded every week. I stood in that hallway with my hand on the doorframe and felt something shift under my feet. The particular vertigo of realizing a person you thought was merely rude had actually been working, quietly, behind the scenes, to get information she had no right to. I asked Carol if she could confirm the caller's name. She could. It was Vivian. I asked, because my mind had already jumped backward 3 weeks to that dinner table, whether this was the first time. Carol hesitated, the particular hesitation of someone deciding how much of her own job to risk for a patient she liked. "Off the record," she said, "there was a call back in April too, before you were even showing much. Someone asking about how the pregnancy was progressing, weight-wise. We didn't confirm anything then either, but I remember it because it was an odd thing to ask. April. That was 3 weeks before the Sunday dinner where Vivian announced, over pork chops, that I'd gained 26 pounds, a number I had never said out loud to anyone at that table, a number Carol's front desk had, technically, never confirmed either, which meant Vivian had likely been guessing, cross-referencing, fishing for a reaction, and gotten close enough to the truth that none of us had thought to question how she knew it. I stood in that hallway and felt the entire architecture of the last 4 months rearrange itself. It wasn't cruelty delivered in the moment, off the cuff, the way I'd been telling myself to survive it. It was reconnaissance. She had been building a file on my body the same patient, methodical way my mother had been building a file on her behavior, except one of those files was being used to help me, and the other was being used to corner me. I didn't tell Ethan that night. I told my mother. My mother listened to the whole thing without interrupting, sitting at my kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked me a question that seemed strange at the time. "Emma," she said, "who else has Vivian done this to?" I thought about Danielle. I thought about the pause that always followed her name at family dinners, the way Claire had looked at the grill instead of at me. "I don't know," I said. "Nobody talks about it." "Then somebody should," my mother said, and reached for her phone. What my mother did over the next 4 days, I didn't learn until after the shower, in pieces, the way you learn about a surprise party after it's already happened. She called Claire first, not to gossip, but to ask a direct question. Had Vivian ever done anything like this to Danielle? Claire was quiet on the phone for almost a full minute. Then she told my mother something she'd never told me. In the last year of Mark and Danielle's marriage, Danielle had been pregnant. She lost the baby at 11 weeks in January of 2020, 3 months before the divorce was finalized. Vivian had spent that entire pregnancy commenting on Danielle's weight at every family gathering, the same spreadsheet and portion size campaign she'd later run on me. And after the miscarriage, instead of grief, Vivian had told Danielle, at Sunday dinner, in front of the whole family, that maybe the stress of trying to keep the weight off had contributed. Danielle left the table. She left the marriage 4 months later. Nobody in the family had ever said the sentence out loud to explain why, because saying it out loud meant admitting what Vivian had actually done, and it was easier for everyone except Danielle to let the silence stand in for an explanation. My mother hung up the phone that night, sat very still at her own kitchen table, and decided that 50 guests were about to hear a version of Vivian that the family had spent 4 years protecting her from having to hear. 2 days before the shower, my mother sent every guest on the list the same email. Quiet, simple, easy to say yes to. She asked each person to write a short letter to the baby. Hopes, memories, advice, whatever they wanted, seal it in an envelope, and bring it to the party. It read like a sweet, ordinary shower tradition. 50 guests said yes without a second thought. One guest replied only to ask a question about the gift registry and never mention the letters again. That guest was Vivian. The morning of the shower, I found a small cedar box sitting on the gift table, next to the guest book, and asked my mother where it came from. She flapped a dish towel at me, the universal gesture for not yet, and said, "Ask me later." I recognized the box. My father had built it 40 years ago, in the garage where he'd eventually die, as a place to keep the love letters he wrote my mother before they were married. It had sat on her dresser my whole childhood. Now apparently it had a new job, and I had no idea yet what that job was. The party itself was golden for most of the afternoon. String lights strung between the two maples in the back corner, a taco bar Vivian had not been permitted to spreadsheet, a diaper raffle game that had Ethan's uncle laughing so hard he had to sit down in a lawn chair to recover. My students' families had chipped in on a ridiculous oversized card that took up an entire folding table by itself. Priya had brought a playlist she'd built specifically for the party, full of songs from the year I was born, and at one point I caught Vivian actually dancing a little with Gordon near the drink station, and let myself believe for maybe 20 whole minutes that we might get through the day without incident. Ethan grilled corn he'd bought that morning at the farmer's market on Route 91 and burned exactly none of it, a fact he mentioned to at least 6 separate guests. My mother moved through the yard all afternoon with a kind of quiet efficiency, refilling drinks, redirecting a wasp away from the dessert table with a paper fan, checking in on me every 20 minutes without ever hovering. I remember thinking, somewhere around 4 in the afternoon, sun warm on my shoulders, one hand resting on the underside of my belly where Iris had been doing slow, lazy rolls all day, that maybe we'd get through the whole thing clean. Then the sun started dropping behind the fence line, throwing long gold light across the grass, and my mother tapped a spoon against her glass and asked for a few words for Emma, Ethan, and the baby. And Vivian stood up before my mother had even finished the sentence. You already know what she said. 50 guests heard it. The breadbasket line, the gym line, delivered with a bright hostess perfect smile, the kind of smile that had gotten her through 26 years of closing deals on houses she privately thought were overpriced. She said it the way you'd deliver a toast you'd rehearsed in the mirror because she had. I found out later, from Claire, that Vivian had practiced a version of that line on the phone with a friend 2 nights before, calling it, "Just being honest, the way I always am." My mother didn't look at her. That was the detail that stuck with everyone who was there. She never once turned her head toward Vivian, not while Vivian was still talking, not in the silence after. She walked, unhurried, to the gift table. She lifted the lid of the cedar box. She reached past 49 sealed envelopes with names written in different handwriting. Aunt Carol, Uncle Frank, Cousin Priya, Gordon, even Mark, and pulled out one envelope with nothing written on it at all. Blank. She carried it across the patio, past the frozen dessert table, past my husband still riding his overturned chair, and set it down directly in front of Vivian's plate. Square. Deliberate. Like a place setting for a meal Vivian hadn't earned yet. "I saved this one for you," my mother said. Vivian looked down at the envelope, then back up, still smiling the reflexive hostess smile that hadn't caught up yet with what was happening to her. "How thoughtful," she started to say. My mother wasn't finished. She leaned in, close enough that only the front 2 tables could hear her, her voice level, almost gentle, the voice she used to use on a 4th grader who'd been caught in a lie they still thought was working. "When your granddaughter opens this box one day, what exactly do you want her to remember about you?" Vivian looked at the pen sitting beside the envelope. She looked at 50 faces waiting to see what she'd do next. And for the first time in the 4 years I'd known her, my mother-in-law had absolutely nothing to say. The silence went on long enough that it stopped being awkward and started being information. Gordon, who had spent 29 years of marriage saying almost nothing at the dinner table, set down his fork and said quietly but clearly enough for the tables closest to hear, "Vivian, sit down." Not gently, not the tone of a man smoothing things over. The tone of a man who had watched this pattern for longer than any of us, and who had, for reasons of his own, never once stopped it before. Vivian sat. Claire stood up instead. I hadn't planned for this, hadn't asked for it, didn't even know it was coming. She stood at her spot near the dessert table, her voice shaking but audible, and said, "I think some of us have known for a long time that this wasn't the first time, Mom. I think it's time somebody said Danielle's name out loud." A collective intake of breath moved across the yard, 50 people who mostly didn't know the name, watching Vivian's face change in real time as her carefully maintained version of the family history cracked open in front of a caterer's leftover tacos. Vivian found her voice finally, and it came out sharp, defensive, aimed at Claire. "That is not what happened. Danielle was fragile. That marriage was already falling apart. I had nothing to do with—" "You told her the stress of dieting caused the miscarriage," Claire said. "At this table. I was sitting right there. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because this isn't a story about a woman getting her comeuppance in a neat, satisfying way, no matter how the ending might look from the outside. I felt sick. I felt 34 weeks pregnant and exposed and furious, and underneath all of it, genuinely sad, because some small, stubborn part of me had spent 4 years hoping Vivian would eventually become the grandmother she performed being at holidays, and that part of me was watching that hope get buried in real time, in my own backyard, in front of the taco bar. Ethan finally spoke. He'd been quiet through the whole exchange, standing behind my chair chair with his hand on my shoulder, and when he did speak, it wasn't loud, but it was final in a way I'd never heard from him before. "Mom," he said, "you called Emma's doctor's office, pretending to be family, trying to get information about her weight." Vivian's face did something complicated, the surprise of being caught at something she genuinely hadn't expected anyone to trace back to her. "I was concerned," she said. "As a grandmother, I have a right to be concerned." "You don't have a right to lie to a medical office to get it," Ethan said. "And you definitely don't have a right to stand up at a party for my wife and my daughter and turn both of them into a joke." I stood up then, 34 weeks pregnant, my glass of sparkling cider still in my hand, and I said the thing I'd been filing away for 4 years instead of saying it in the moment, the way I'd trained myself to do since that steakhouse dinner about my wedding dress. "I have spent 3 years trying to give you the benefit of the doubt," I said, looking directly at Vivian for the first time all afternoon. "I told myself you didn't mean it. I told myself it was a generational thing, or a bluntness thing, or just how you talk. But you called my doctor's office. You've been keeping score on my body since before I even knew I was carrying this baby, and today you tried to embarrass me in front of 50 people who love us. At a party for a child you claim you're excited to meet. I am done pretending that was ever about honesty. It was never honesty. It was control, and you don't get to have it anymore." Vivian's hands were shaking around the stem of her champagne flute. For a moment, I thought she might actually apologize, might finally reach the bottom of whatever well she'd been drawing from for 20-some years of doing this to the women who married into her family. Around the patio, I could see 50 faces doing the math in real time. My Aunt Denise with her hand pressed to her chest, Ethan's Uncle Frank staring hard at his plate, a co-worker of mine from Briar Hill Elementary who would later tell me she'd never seen an adult get quietly dismantled in broad daylight before and hadn't known it could happen without anyone raising their voice. Priya, Mark's girlfriend, reached over and took Danielle's old seat at the family table without anyone asking her to, an instinctive gesture of solidarity from someone who'd only been dating into this family for 8 months and had clearly already taken notes. Vivian didn't apologize. Instead, she stood up, chair scraping against the patio stone, and said, "I refuse to be lectured at my own son's home by people who don't understand what it's like to watch your family change," and walked off the patio toward the driveway, leaving the blank envelope exactly where my mother had placed it. My mother didn't call after her. She simply picked the envelope back up, folded the flap closed over nothing at all, and set it back inside the cedar box, gently, the way you'd close a book you weren't finished with yet. Gordon didn't go after her. He sat at the table a moment longer, looked at the cedar box, and then, quietly, picked up the pen and pulled the blank envelope toward himself instead. "I'll write one," he said, to no one in particular, and started writing. I asked my mother, days later, how she'd known to do any of it. The letters, the blank envelope, the exact right sentence at the exact right moment. She was quiet for a while before she answered. "My own mother-in-law did something similar to me, at your christening," she finally said. "Different words, same shape, told the whole church basement I looked like I'd let myself go having you." I'd never heard this story in 31 years. "I didn't have anyone in my corner that day," she said. "Your father tried, but he didn't know how yet, and by the time he learned, the damage was already done. I decided a long time ago that if I ever got the chance to stand in a corner for someone, I'd take it." It was the closest my mother has ever come to explaining herself, and it recontextualized 4 years of her quiet, watchful patience into something closer to a promise she'd made to a version of herself, standing in a church basement 31 years earlier, holding a newborn and absorbing an insult with nowhere to put it. That night set off consequences that took the better part of 2 months to settle, and none of them arrived cleanly. Vivian called Ethan the next morning, not to apologize, but to say she felt ambushed, and that my mother had clearly been planning this the whole time, as though premeditated kindness toward a room full of guests and one carefully placed envelope constituted an ambush, while 3 years of body commentary and a call to a medical office constituted concern. Ethan didn't argue with her logic. He simply told her that until she was ready to apologize to me directly, not through him, not through a card, she wasn't welcome at the hospital when the baby was born. Vivian hung up on him. The family split, more or less exactly along the lines you'd expect and a few you wouldn't. Claire stopped speaking to her mother for 6 weeks, the longest silence between them in Claire's adult life, and started speaking to Danielle again for the first time since the divorce. A text exchange that turned into a phone call that turned into coffee. The two of them comparing notes on a woman who had, it turned out, run nearly the same campaign on both of them with only the details changed. Danielle told Claire something that Claire later told me, that after the miscarriage, when Danielle had needed her mother-in-law to say almost anything comforting, Vivian had instead brought up, unprompted, that Danielle's sister had always struggled with her weight too, as though grief and genetics were the same conversation. Danielle sent me a message a week after the shower, someone I'd met maybe 4 times in my life, and it was one of the kindest things anyone said to me that whole summer. "I wish someone had done for me what your mom did for you," she wrote. "I left because I thought it was just me. It wasn't just me." We ended up talking on the phone for almost 2 hours that first week, the two of us laughing. In the dark way you laugh about things that used to just hurt, about the spreadsheet. It turned out Vivian had run a nearly identical portion-size email campaign on Danielle's own baby shower back in 2019, down to the phrase, "Keep it light, she'll thank us later," which meant Vivian hadn't even bothered writing a new script the second time around, just recycled the old one and swapped out the name. Danielle told me she'd kept the original email for years, unsure why, and finally deleted it the week after my shower, once she understood that someone else had finally seen what she'd seen. Claire's 6 weeks of silence with her mother ended, eventually, not with an apology from Vivian, but with a long letter Claire wrote and never sent, one she read to me over coffee instead, working through it out loud the way you work through something you're still deciding whether you believe. I keep waiting for her to just say it, Claire told me. Not even a big apology. Just, I did that, and it was wrong. 5 words. She can't do it. I don't think she's ever done it in her life. Claire started therapy that August, her first time, and told me once, offhand, that the biggest thing she'd learned in 3 months was that growing up watching someone weaponize love doesn't teach you what love is. It teaches you what love costs, and that those aren't the same lesson at all. Mark, to his credit, didn't defend his mother. He'd been quiet at the shower, quiet in the weeks after, and then one Sunday in July, he drove out to see Ethan and me without Vivian knowing, and apologized for something that wasn't his to apologize for, in the specific guilty way people do when they've spent years being a bystander and finally have to reckon with what that silence cost. I knew what happened with Danielle, he said, turning a coffee mug in his hands at our kitchen table. I just didn't want it to be true, so I let it not be true. I'm not going to do that again. He and Priya got engaged that October. Vivian was not invited to help plan the wedding menu. Gordon surprised everyone the most. 29 years of near silence at that dinner table, and it turned out he'd been watching the whole time, filing his own version of the file my mother kept, except his had nowhere to go, no plan attached, just decades of a man who'd married a woman he loved and slowly learned to make himself small so the house would stay quiet. He moved out of the house in Chagrin Falls in August, not dramatically, not with a lawyer trailing him, just a slow, methodical relocation to an apartment 11 minutes away, the kind of thing he later described to Ethan as not a punishment, just finally being honest about how long I'd been unhappy. He and Vivian didn't divorce. They didn't reconcile either. They existed separately in a holding pattern that Ethan found harder to watch than almost anything else that summer, because it meant his father had spent nearly 3 decades absorbing what the rest of us had only had to survive for a handful of years. An unexpected ally showed up in August, in the form of a woman named Ruth Halloran, who had worked alongside Vivian at the brokerage for 19 years before retiring in 2019. Ruth found me through Claire, of all people, and asked gently if she could take me to coffee. Over decaf at a diner in Solon, Ruth told me that Vivian had done a version of this to junior agents for years, weighing in on their appearance before big listing presentations, calling it professional feedback, watching 2 young women leave the brokerage within a year of each other without ever connecting the dots publicly. I always wondered if anyone in her actual family saw what the rest of us saw, Ruth said, stirring sugar into her coffee that she never drank. I'm glad someone finally did something about it. I just wish it hadn't taken this long. Ruth's account didn't change anything legally or logistically, but it did something else, something I hadn't realized I still needed. It confirmed that none of this had been about me specifically, or Danielle specifically, or even the family specifically. It was a pattern that had been running for decades, largely unchecked because the people close enough to notice it had also been too close to it to say so. Vivian tried a few things in those 2 months, each more desperate than the last. She showed up at our house in September, 7 months along by then, uninvited, with a gift, a stroller, expensive, the kind we'd already registered for and already received from my coworkers, and stood on our porch holding it like a peace offering that had a receipt attached. I watched from the living room window, staying back, letting Ethan handle it, my heart doing something complicated and fast in my chest. Ethan met her at the door alone, and I could see, even through the glass, the shape of the conversation, Vivian's hands moving the way they did when she was building a case, Ethan's stillness, the particular stillness of a person who has decided in advance not to be moved. He told her, kindly but immovably, that a gift wasn't an apology, and that she was welcome to come back when she had one. She left the stroller on the porch anyway, still boxed, and it sat there for 4 days until Ethan finally carried it to the garage, where it remained, untouched, until we donated it to a shelter in November, unopened, tags still on, the same way her silk dress had come to me 8 months earlier. A gift assembled entirely out of what she wanted to be true rather than anything either of us had asked for. She tried calling my mother directly, a conversation my mother told me about afterward with something close to amusement, in which Vivian accused her of turning the whole family against me. And my mother said evenly, "Vivian, I didn't turn anyone. I just stopped being quiet at the same time everyone else did." She tried finally, a long email to me in October, 4 paragraphs, that opened with, "I've had time to reflect," and closed 3 paragraphs later, without ever actually using the word sorry, landing instead on, "I hope you can understand that I only ever wanted what was best for this family." I read it twice. I didn't respond. Some letters don't deserve an answer. They deserve to be understood for what they are, which in this case was one more attempt to be forgiven without having to name what she'd done. There was a legal complication too, one that added a strange procedural texture to a summer that otherwise felt entirely emotional. When Ethan looked into the medical office calls, on the advice of a friend who worked in healthcare compliance, Riverside OB/GYN confirmed in writing that someone matching Vivian's information had called twice attempting to obtain protected health information under false pretenses. It wasn't the kind of thing that was was going to end in handcuffs, but the practice flagged the account, formally, and sent a letter, the kind of institutional, unemotional letter that somehow does more damage to a person's self-image than an argument ever could, informing Vivian that any further contact regarding a patient's records without authorization would be referred to their compliance office and could constitute a violation subject to formal reporting. Ethan told me later that his mother had called him within an hour of receiving it, her voice tight in a way he'd rarely heard, asking whether he'd been the one to sick the lawyers on her, as though a compliance letter from an OB/GYN practice constituted a legal ambush rather than the ordinary mild consequence of contacting a medical office under false pretenses. Vivian called that letter an overreaction. Ethan told her it was the mildest possible outcome of what she'd actually done. There was a smaller, stranger complication that came out of the same investigation. When the practice manager at Riverside pulled the account notes to prepare their letter, she found something none of us had anticipated. A message left on the practice's general voicemail back in March, before I'd even told most of the family I was pregnant, from a caller who didn't leave a name but whose voice, once Carol played it for Ethan at his request, was unmistakably Vivian's. In it, she asked whether the office could flag my file so she'd be notified of any appointments, since Emma isn't always forthcoming with the family. I had told Vivian I was pregnant myself, in person, 4 days after I told my own mother. There had been no reason for her to already be asking about my file before that. The only explanation any of us could land on was that she'd suspected before we announced it, likely from some offhand comment of Ethan's about scheduling, and had gone looking for confirmation through the clinic rather than simply asking either of us directly. It was a small detail in the grand scheme of everything else that summer, but it was the one that finally made Ethan stop trying to find a charitable explanation for his mother's behavior. She wanted to know before we were ready to tell her, he said, sitting at our kitchen table with the voicemail transcript printed out in front of him. Not because she loves the baby that much, because she didn't want to be the last to know something. That's not love, that's just control wearing a nicer coat. I mourned something that summer too, and I think it's important to say that plainly, because this isn't a story where the villain gets what's coming to her and everyone moves on feeling clean. I mourned the grandmother I'd hoped Vivian could become, the version of her I used to imagine at Christmas mornings, teaching my daughter to bake the lemon cake she'd been frosting the day she told me doctors say what patients pay to hear. I'd pictured more than once during the easier stretches of our relationship, Vivian showing up with flashcards for Iris, or taking her to open houses the way she used to take Ethan as a boy, narrating crown molding and load-bearing walls, passing down some small specific piece of herself that had nothing to do with anyone's weight. That version of Vivian existed only in my head, I understand now, assembled out of the handful of genuinely warm moments she'd given me over 4 years, a hand-knit blanket she'd made before we even started trying, unprompted, a rare afternoon at her kitchen table where she'd told me, without an edge in her voice, about learning to drive stick shift on her own father's farm in the 60s. Those moments were real. They just weren't the whole picture, and I'd spent years mistaking a handful of good afternoons for evidence that the rest could be forgiven, or fixed, or waited out. I cried once, hard, alone, in the nursery we hadn't finished painting yet, sitting on the floor with a paint swatch card in my hand. Not because I regretted what my mother had done, but because some part of me had wanted, badly, for none of it to have been necessary. I cried again, quieter, a few weeks later, folding a stack of onesies Vivian had bought before any of this happened, back when her intentions still felt uncomplicated, and realizing I couldn't fully separate the gift from the giver anymore, that even her kindness now arrived pre-shadowed by everything I knew. Grief doesn't always show up where you expect it. Sometimes it shows up in the space where a relationship could have gone right and simply didn't. In a drawer full of onesies, you can't quite look at the same way twice. My daughter Iris was born on a Thursday in December, 7 pounds 2 ounces, with my father's stubborn chin, according to my mother, who cried the moment the nurse handed her the swaddled bundle in the hallway. Vivian did not come to the hospital. She sent a card 3 days later with a small silver rattle inside and no letter at all this time. No long paragraph about reflection. Just her name, signed at the bottom, small. I don't know yet what our relationship with Vivian will look like when Iris is old enough to ask questions. Ethan and I have talked about it, carefully, more than once. Usually late at night after Iris is finally down, the two of us at the kitchen table where so much of this story got decided in the first place. We've agreed on this much. She will always be welcome to try again, on our terms, at our pace, with actual accountability instead of a stroller on the porch. She hasn't tried yet, not in the way that would count. Some days I think she will. Some days I think Gordon's slow, quiet departure from that house is the only honest thing that's happened in that family in 30 years, and that Vivian is simply not built for the kind of reckoning this would require. Either way, that door stays open a crack. Not because I owe her that, but because I want Iris to grow up watching her mother choose grace deliberately, on her own terms and in her own time, rather than absorb it as a debt someone else decided she owed. Life, in the ordinary sense, has mostly settled since then. Iris is 7 months old now, loud in the mornings, indifferent to bedtime, obsessed with a stuffed elephant Claire gave her that has since lost one ear to the dog. I went back to my classroom at Briar Hill in March, part-time at first, and my 4th graders drew Iris approximately 400 crayon portraits, most of them anatomically alarming, all of them taped to my refrigerator. Ethan and I still argue about normal things now, whose turn it is for the 2 a.m. feeding, whether we're really going to repaint the guest room this year. The small, blessedly boring arguments of people whose biggest fight is finally behind them instead of ahead. Gordon comes over most Sundays, alone, and has become, unexpectedly, a wonderful grandfather. The kind who gets down on the floor without being asked and stays there until his knees give out. He brought a wooden rattle he'd carved himself in his garage workshop the first time he visited after Iris was born. No card, no explanation, just set it in her bassinet and said, "Made this in a weekend, figured it beat something store-bought." It's her favorite toy now, more chewed than carved at this point, and I think about the cedar box every time I see it in her crib. Two objects built by two quiet men in two different garages, decades apart, both of them saying with their hands what the women around them had to learn to say out loud. Mark and Priya's wedding is in June at a small vineyard outside Chagrin Falls, and Priya has already asked me, half joking, half not, whether there's anything she should know before officially becoming a Cole. I told her the truth, that the family is kinder than its worst afternoon, and that the people worth marrying into it have already shown her exactly who they are. Danielle is coming as a guest of Claire's, the first family event she's attended in 5 years, and when Claire told me, I had to sit down for a minute, not from sadness exactly, but from the particular fullness of watching a door reopen that everyone had assumed was welded shut. I planned to save her a seat near mine, close enough that if anyone at that vineyard tries anything resembling a toast about anyone's body, two women who already know exactly what that sounds like will be sitting shoulder to shoulder, ready. I think about the cedar box more than I expected to. It sits on Iris's dresser now, 49 letters inside it, 49 people who showed up for her before she could even understand what showing up meant, and one blank envelope that Vivian never picked up, that my mother eventually folded shut anyway and tucked in alongside the rest, unsigned, unfilled, a strange kind of monument to a question nobody answered out loud. Some nights, rocking Iris to sleep in the dark, I think about what my mother asked at that table. When your granddaughter opens this box one day, what exactly do you want her to remember about you? I think it's the only question that actually matters, in families like ours, and probably in most families, if you're honest. Not what you meant. Not how you'd explain yourself if someone finally called you out in front of 50 people. Just plainly, what do you want to be remembered for, when the people you spent years measuring are finally old enough to measure you back? I don't know what Vivian's answer would have been that day. I don't think she knew either, which is its own kind of answer, but I know what I want mine to be, and I write it down more often now than I used to, in a notebook I keep in Iris's nursery. Little entries for a girl who won't read them for years. Not a performance of love, just the plain, unglamorous evidence of it, the kind that doesn't need 50 guests watching to be real. My mother taught me that, in the end, more than she taught me anything else that summer, that the people who love you well rarely need an audience to prove it, and the people who need the audience are usually the ones who have the least to actually say once the room goes quiet. I think, too, about how long it took me to stop mistaking silence for peace. For 3 years, I told myself that letting Vivian's comments slide was the mature thing, the generous thing, the thing a bigger person did. What I understand now is that I wasn't being generous. I was being afraid. Afraid of conflict, afraid of being called dramatic, afraid of being the daughter-in-law who couldn't take a joke. Vivian counted on exactly that fear in every woman who married into her family, and for a while, it worked on me the same way it had worked on Danielle. The difference, in the end, wasn't that I became braver than Danielle had been. The difference was that somebody finally stood behind me who refused to let the fear win by default. That's not a small thing. I don't think I would have found my own voice that day without my mother handing me the room to use it in. There's a version of this story, the kind I used to see shared online with a neat, satisfying caption, where I tell you, Vivian changed completely, where the blank envelope became the turning point in some tidy redemption arc, where she showed up at Iris's first birthday party with tears in her eyes and finally said the 5 words Claire has been waiting a lifetime to hear. That isn't what happened, and I'd rather tell you the true, unfinished version of it than the satisfying one, because the true version is the one that might actually help someone. Vivian sent a card on Iris's half-birthday, unprompted, no note beyond her name, small. It might be the beginning of something, it might be nothing at all. I've stopped needing to know which in advance in order to keep living my life well in the meantime. 50 guests came to that shower expecting cake and diaper games. What they got instead was a lesson none of them will forget, delivered by a 5'2" retired school teacher who never once raised her voice and who taught all of us, myself included, that the calmest person in the room is usually the one who already knows exactly how the story ends. I think about that lesson every time I catch myself starting to shrink at a dinner table, every time I feel the old instinct to file something away instead of saying it out loud, every time I want to laugh off a comment that deserves an answer instead. I don't shrink anymore. That, more than anything else, is what my mother actually gave Iris that day. Not a viral moment, not a takedown, but a mother who finally stopped eating for 2 in every sense of the phrase, and started instead taking up exactly the space she was always entitled to, out loud at every table she sits at from now on.